All right, so chapter 10 is a record of the descendants of Noah. And so if you recall from our previous studies, the flood has occurred, and so they have settled and come out of the ark. And so what is the command that God gives to Noah in chapter 9? What is he told to do when he gets out of the ark? Go forth and replenish the earth, right? And so what we see in chapter 10 is the record of people going and where these families, how his sons, where they go and where they settle and their descendants. And so we see each of the families as they go through this chapter. So real quick, we'll go through an outline of the chapter, and then we'll look at some lessons that Israel might have gleaned from the text, as well as some lessons for us. And so we see that it starts out by establishing this starting point with this introduction. It talks about the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And in that first section, in 2 through 5, we have listed the sons or the descendants of Japheth. And I don't know about you, but I know when I was younger, I always kind of saw chapters like this as a lot of really hard names to try and somebody would always ask me to read out loud. It figured in class, and so some of them it at times can seem like a long list of names. And I remember thinking, this is kind of skippable content, isn't it? If we were kind of using modern terminology. But what at least I really have started to appreciate is when you see these generations and what happens, and we look at it in a broader context, we see things like God's plan. We see things like the trouble that's going to come, but also the blessings that are going to come. And so in the sons of Japheth, you have names like Gomer and Magog and Javan and their clans, and these are the people that are, I think, associated with like Asia Minor and some of the more northern regions of the known world, and they spread that way. There's 7 sons that are mentioned in here, several grandsons. And it ends with, from these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. And so as this settlement occurs, people are going off in their own clans, they're going off in their own groups and forming their own peoples, their own nations, their own groups. And so I think one of the points of significance from all of these is it's highlighting the geographic and even the linguistic difference of God's creation as it goes into these different places. That second section is the descendants of Ham. This is verses 6 through 20, and we do get a little bit more detail on some of these people. We see names like Cush and Mizraim, Canaan, and their descendants. And these would be people associated with regions like Africa, and specifically like Egypt and Ethiopia, but also the Canaanite territories. Some notable figures include Nimrod, and it refers to him in verse 9 as, says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And so we get a little bit of kind of preliminary information. It says, I guess if you back up to verse 8, he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. And so I know growing up, Nimrod was kind of something we called our brothers, right? And so it was, but you look at the name here, and it had a different meaning. He was the first mighty man. And so we know from the following text here that he was the ruler of Babel, and we'll see where Babel takes us in just a moment. But I think it kind of gives us a little bit of foreshadowing of man's quest for power and desire for ambition. And then in 21 through 31, we see the sons of Shem, and what was kind of the key significance of the line of Shem, especially to Israel. It was the lineage that led to Abraham, and so this one is obviously a different tree of descendants in that what we know, and looking again at that broader context, we see that this is where God's chosen people emerge from. Shem was described as the father of all the children of Eber, which a lot of people connect that to the word Hebrews, and that origin of that term. And it also ends with a similar refrain like we've seen before. These are the clans of the sons of Shem, by their clans, languages, lands, and nations. And so I think the thing that we see in this is we see God has saved his people. He's saved his people through Noah, and he saved people that were still committed to following him. And now they come out on the other side and they start to populate the earth. They're resettling places that now have no people. And as these descendants grow and multiply, to me, at least, I think what we see is that we see that it doesn't take a long time. I mean, yes, it takes generations, and we've got a lot of descendants here, but relatively speaking, man is kind of back to his old ways pretty quick after the flood, isn't he? And so the flood wasn't a cure-all in terms of, having nothing but good people after that. And so, of course, we know that now. And then finally, we see the last part of this chapter is just kind of wraps it up. It summarizes the chapters, just like it said that for each one of the sons. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies and their nations. And from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And that's how it ends that chapter. Ties these genealogies together and really gives us an idea of how humanity repopulated the earth post-flood. If we look at the lessons that we can learn, or at least the lessons that Israel probably would have learned, I think one of them is that there's this unity and diversity of mankind, that all nations were stem from a single family, and it would have helped, hopefully, I think. We kind of think about Israel's history and the conflicts that they had with the descendants of Ham and Japheth, and you think about, looking back and it should have at least given them an idea that there's still a relationship there, right? And those are still God's creation. However, what we do know is that God had chosen the nation of Israel for a certain purpose. That was to preserve his plan, and that was how he was carrying out his plan for which ultimately went to Abraham and then went to Jesus. We see I think a little bit of God's sovereignty over history. Specifically, God rules over the history of mankind. Certainly Israel should have learned this lesson in a lot of places. I think, especially if you think about coming out of Egypt, they saw direct intervention from God. But this orderly listing of nations suggests that God's intentional design in the distribution of his people was preparing the world for the unfolding of his plan. And all of this, when you look at it again in that broader context, you see that God was was populating the earth with people who ultimately would lead to people who would lead to us. And we see this narrative come full circle later on, but Israel would have seen that God was very involved in how all of this occurred. I think too there probably could have been a lesson about conflict and redemption. Certainly, Ham's line includes the Canaanites, Nimrod, hinting at future opposition to God's people. And then, of course, Shem's line, as we mentioned a second ago, points towards the covenant with Abraham. And so there would have been this lesson signaling hope and God's redemptive power and his focus on his people. And then finally, I just mentioned this a second ago too, post-flood mankind, man still has the same issues. He comes out of this and pride becomes an issue, power becomes an issue. What man wants becomes more important to man than what God wants. And so we quickly see that. Any comments on maybe lessons for Israel? Yes, sir.
In the 11th chapter, when it turns to the descendants of Shem, it starts with the phrase, "These are the records of the generation of Shem." One of the things, and then later in that pericope, there's a discussion of Terah and Abraham's father, are in Ur of the Chaldeans. And
Yeah, at the end of 11.
when I was little, I was told that Ur was up in the north. And since that time, very recently, it's apparent that Ur is down on the emptying of the Tigris and the Euphrates into the Red Sea. And that is where the Sumerians were found, and that's where it is said that the generation of writing and cuneiform and records began in that area. So God says these are the records of the people that he's keeping account of, apparently, even though he has certainly given account of the children of Noah's two other sons. But I think it's significant to know that I've always wondered how well could the Israelites read and write as a people. And we don't have a lot of information on how writing developed, but lots of books have been written, but it's not clear. And we didn't really discover how to interpret the Egyptian language until I think the 1920s, as a result of the stone that one of the officers of Napoleon's army discovered in Egypt, and that Rosetta Stone came back and broke the code on cuneiform, and at least for the Egyptian language, and that was actually in the last century.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an appreciation we get too from both that part in chapter 11, but also looking in chapter 10, just about the enormity of civilization and how God's hand in repopulating the earth. If you look at, and we'll talk about this in a second, but in chapter 11, where we see these lifespans, and they're shortening, but shortening to half a millennium, and then they get a little shorter after that. But God's extending the life of mankind, and we see his work in that because it allows for these populations to grow, civilizations to be built, and it also reminds us that there's a lot of, while there's history in here in these genealogies, there's a lot of history we don't know about. There's a lot of the purpose of this chapter isn't necessarily to tie it to as proof of all the things that have happened in world history. What it does, though, is it gives us an idea that, hey, God was behind this population growth, and that it was all according to His plan. All right, a couple lessons for us, and I think sometimes these lessons for the Israelites will be very similar to what we see, but some things are different, and I just want us to remember that and like I said earlier, is when I was younger I didn't maybe appreciate these like I should, but genealogy in biblical genealogy is purposeful history. I mean, there's a plan behind it. There's a reason that God is enumerating the people that He's enumerating, and that He's keeping track of and making these records for Israel. Unlike modern genealogy for curiosity, it serves a purpose to show how God's promise to Noah is fulfilled. And so it also, we see, I guess, at least some early lessons on power and ambition can become real problems. Nimrod, again, stands out as that symbol of strength and self-reliance. If you think about, he was a mighty man, he was a hunter. He had a reputation as being a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that was what was said about him. Not that being a mighty hunter or a mighty man was in itself wrong, but what we see from him, and especially when you think about this idea of self-reliance, that can hit close to home for us as Americans, because we tend to be a people who pride ourselves on being self-reliant, and that's I think a real difficulty sometimes for Christians, is that we can fall into the mindset of the people around us, and that that we're capable of handling things that we should be relying on the Lord for. We see God's plan continue through Shem, which ultimately leads to Abraham and then Jesus. So Genesis 10 is more than a list of dry names. It's a bridge between the flood and the Tower of Babel. It illustrates how humanity multiplied and spread under God's oversight, and it teaches us that all people share a common origin, yet their diversity and destinies are shaped by their responses to God. And we'll see some examples of that here in the next couple chapters. Japheth's, Ham's, and Shem's descendants populate the world, but Shem's line carries the torch of God's covenant, while figures like Nimrod hint at the challenges ahead. All right. Anything else on chapter 10 before we go into 11? All right. Let's see if that's the right way. All right. So chapter 11, of course, we have the account of the Tower of Babel. And so we have humanity, it talks about it. It says the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So the Tower of Babel that's something that we teach the young children about because it's a what we might call a good Bible story. Okay, and it's one of those ones where I remember thinking a lot. Again, when I was younger, I remember thinking a lot, and so I'm getting ready for this. Could they really do this? I mean, it's. I think maybe I'm the only one. It sounds like the most preposterous thing that people back then would try to build a tower all the way to the heavens. I'm not an engineer. There's some engineers in the audience, but it seems like that'd be a pretty hard thing to do. And given what maybe they had even been able to accomplish at the time, I always thought surely somebody is the skeptic. Going, guys, this is really a big project, right? So, but is that the point? It's never the point, is it? It's never the point to God. It's more about, I think, the state of mankind and their attitude towards themselves. What is God's real problem with the tower? Is God worried they're going to get to heaven? Right, the pride of the people.
It's in direct contradiction to the command to spread and populate the earth.
Yeah, because they're coalescing in one place, right? And so it's in direct contradiction to what they've been told to do. And but it's also it's their pride. It's the people saying we can do this. Trish, and then we'll come up here.
Well, it shows their arrogancy in thinking they could build anything to reach God. God was so far out of their reach, and they didn't have a clue.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised he didn't do worse to them than scatter them.
Right. We got one up here.
It's what Jesus spoke in the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God. And the poor in the spirit is one who is full of himself.
Mm-hmm.
And is poor in spirit is not full of himself, excuse me.
Opposite, right.
And I just think that's one of the first things in the Beatitudes that we try to understand.
Yes, ma'am.
One other quick thing. Verse 9, it says, God scattered them all face of the earth. It's really telling what happened in chapter 10. 10 is the result of what God had to do, because God had given them a commandment, and they were refusing to do it. And so God took care of it, and the commandment was obeyed, and now they are scattered all over the earth.
Right.
So 10 is really, a lot of times that's how the Hebrew books are written anyway. But 10, you might not think that's kind of a strange chapter, but really the next 11 verses of chapter 11 explains exactly why 10 happened. Mm-hmm. And that's what that little short segment is.
Yep.
And it also kind of reminds me of when God told the apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel. It took a persecution to make them leave Jerusalem. God will see to it that his word is carried out one way or the other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that God says, if as one people, all sharing a common language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be beyond them. If you look at the history of the world, some of the greatest technological advances have come throughout history as a result of a predominant language being held throughout a region. So, for example, in the time of Rome, Greek was the common language of the known world, if you will, at the time. And there were a number of technological advances that happened during that time, Roman aqueducts, architecture, and other things that have lasted for thousands of years. And that kind of progress wasn't seen again until roughly the 19th century, when English became a predominant language due to the British Empire. And suddenly you have another explosion of technology and advances in science and other things like that. So there is definitely something to be said for what happens when a common language is found among people, that we have this capacity for great discoveries and advancements and things like that. Now, obviously, we're not on God's level, but it's easy to see when we look at the pattern in history what God is talking about here.
And when those, if you look at history, and when that common language emerges and we have this great advancement, man moves closer to God, right? No. Correlation and causation aside, but there is something to be said of when man, the more we become reliant on ourselves, the more we become convinced that, and I think that's what we see right here, where he says, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. He's not saying that nothing will be impossible, but in our eye, and I thought maybe you were going here with this too. When we have these technological advances, a lot of times it's carried out by people who just won't accept impossible, and we remember the ones it worked out for. The ones that, you remember the old movies of people trying to learn how to fly, right? They're just jumping off cliffs with bird wings strapped to their arms. And so, but I think, our history as mankind is full of people who believe that nothing was impossible for them, and a lot of them met their maker realizing it was impossible for them. All right. The next section is more genealogy. We talked about it a few minutes ago, but we see the focus becomes now on the descendants of Shem, and in the connection now from Noah to Abraham. And so in this we see multiple generations. It leads to Terah, who was Abraham's father, or Abram's father. And so we get down, and as I mentioned earlier, we see some accounts of the lifespans starting to decrease from 500 years in verse 11. It says Shem lived after he fathered Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. And so we see then 400 years, and we get down to, I believe, Terah. He was 70 years old when he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And then I think he lived a couple hundred years. Yeah, down to verse 32. So you see the lifespan of man diminishing or shortening. And this section ends with Terah and his three sons. And then there's a section where it talks about Terah's family in more detail and a migration that they make. And so we see who his sons are. And Haran dies relatively young. And who was Haran's son? Right, Lot. And so he is, of course, got a close relationship with Abraham, with Abram. We see that he marries Sarah in this section. Nahor gets married, and the family moves toward Canaan, but settles in Haran, and that's where Terah dies.
Matt,
Yes, sir.
this is a place in my Bible where I've made a note for myself to remember that at the point that Abram is born, Noah is still alive for another 50-something years beyond that. And Shem continued to be alive throughout the life of Abraham. and so it's a real intriguing thing to be reminded. Anyone who wanted to know about the God who brought the the end of the previous generations and the beginning of these new generations could learn those things from the first-hand people.
Firsthand, yeah. That's a good point. All right. Some lessons for Israel. Again, human pride and ambition. When driven by pride and self-glorification rather than devotion to God, it'll lead to failure. There's a lesson in unity of purpose and cooperation can be powerful, and Israel experienced this firsthand when Israel was unified in purpose and they cooperated and they followed God. If you think about when they were taking possession of the land, what was the outcome? They were successful. When they ultimately started doing what they wanted to do, you can even jump forward. It ends up in a divided kingdom. I'd say it probably did start before that. I mean, when they decided they wanted a king, and God gives them a king, but that wasn't what God wanted for Israel, but there is a lesson here that unity and of purpose and cooperation can be very powerful. Again, I think there's a lesson here about God's sovereignty, and it prevails over human plans, not just history. And as we see in several places, God has and will intervene when He sees fit, and He will thwart man's plans, and He will do things to show not only His own people but the rest of mankind that He is sovereign and that He is in control. And if you think about just God and getting involved and then in what man is trying to do, I think about the people that have resisted God, and specifically the Israelites would have known of Pharaoh standing up to God and how that worked out, and so we see that in Exodus 7 and those following chapters. Pharaoh tried to stand up and negotiate and contend and stand against God, and God directly intervened and sent the plagues and ultimately killed the firstborn of Egypt and freed the people. And so this certainly would have been a reminder that that wasn't atypical for God. Some lessons for us. I think that we see some similar lessons here: pride versus humility. Of course, for Christians today, we have the ideal in Jesus, and we see the example that Jesus set with humility. That like if you look at Philippians chapter 2, where Paul talks about Jesus' humility, that He emptied Himself, that He didn't seek what was rightfully due Him. Instead, he gave Himself up and took on the cross and became the sacrifice for all mankind. So He made Himself nothing, is what it says. And so that's, of course, the ultimate model, showing that humility leads to eternity with God. Again, I think there's some lessons in here. We're kind of going to have to move, or we're only going to get halfway through. But unity of purpose and cooperation, certainly there's lessons for us. I think it's a reminder that divine judgment is real. And I don't think we can not remind ourselves enough that divine judgment is real. And so too many people, ourselves sometimes included, can go through life and not... just not consider enough that God, there will come a time when God will say, enough, I'm going to intervene. And when He does the last time, He'll judge all of mankind. Scott?
Try to make this quick because I know
Okay.
you still got other things to cover. But, I look at this chapter, chapter 11 and the genealogies, and as well as the genealogies and other places that are mentioned. And generally it goes something, so-and-so father lived so long, father to child, and then he lived another so long, and then, and had other sons and daughters, and that's all it's said about them. I mean, and this is really, for most all of us, is really what our life consists of. And what I mean by that is, 100 years from now, people are not going to know who Scott Goebel is. I mean, at best, they might remember that I lived so long and I had children. And so we kind of see the way of the earth for almost all of us is our heritage comes through our children. But even more than that is that ultimately in and of ourselves, we don't, I mean, very rarely is someone going to do something so awesome that they're known hundreds and hundreds of years later. I mean, they're just, and so we have to think about then, what does that say about the purpose of life? And I think as we're going through this and through the Bible gives us that purpose. Our purpose is to serve our Maker so that we do live eternally. Because otherwise, I mean, really, if we're thinking about this earth and what we leave behind, for the most part, it's just going to be, we lived so long and had sons and daughters.
Yeah.
For almost all of us. So I think there's a powerful lesson to tell us, or maybe a humbling lesson to tell us about ourselves, and really, we only going through this way once, and the thing about it is we better make sure that we have a relationship with our Maker.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so chapter 12, we have the call of Abram. And so he commands him to leave his homeland and take his family with him. And he promises him, of course, three things. He makes those great promises to Abraham, that he would make him a great nation, he would bless him and make his name great, and he would bless all the families of the earth through him. We see in chapter 12, we see Abram's obedience at the age of 75, is when this occurs about, and he obeys God, and while 75 wasn't, I guess, as old to, maybe it wasn't as old to Abram as it was 75's. He wasn't a 30-year-old man, and so certainly there's a lesson for us in that. We see them arrive in Canaan. And what happens when they get to Canaan? Well, God appears to him, though. When they get there, God appears to him, and what is Abram's reaction to God appearing to them getting to Canaan? Yeah, he builds an altar, worship, right? So Abram builds an altar, or builds altars to God at Shechem and Bethel, and so marks that journey and that arrival with worship and faith. Then we have the famine that drives them to Egypt. And we have, of course, this account. Oops, went the wrong way. And they're in Egypt, and we see that Abram, of course, we see he isn't perfect. We know he's not perfect, but we see that. He tells this half-truth, and of course Pharaoh rebukes him and sends him away because of what could have come out of that. But so we see a little bit of I think a side of Abraham and Abram that we don't normally I think about. But it doesn't diminish the fact that he still was faithful to God and that he obeyed him. Some of the lessons, importance of obedience to God's call, God's faithfulness to his promise. Of course, that would have been a central lesson for Israel. God's promise to Abram, land, descendants, and the blessing, begins unfolding even though there's obstacles in the way. The famine drives them out of the land. And we see over time that these promises, every time they seem to look like they're not going to come to fruition, they do. And God's plan continues, not thwarted by man, And so certainly that would have been central to Israel. We see an example of faith amid imperfection. We see a lesson about worship in response to God's presence, and also God's intervention with Pharaoh demonstrates his authority over even the mightiest rulers. Let's see. A couple lessons for us. Following requires faith. And so that's, of course, the lesson that we can take from Abram. And so it mirrors what we're called to do today. We're called to step out in faith and trust God's direction even when our future is uncertain. And so it mirrors the call to follow Christ. Oftentimes we too are required to surrender our security, and what we are comfortable with and what we know. And so God doesn't make a promise to us that we'll always be comfortable and that we'll have all those things. What he does promise to us, though, is that if we follow him, he will provide for us. He will care for us. We see a lesson for, I think, the wonderful blessings of God, that they're meant to be shared. Think about what we see in Jesus in Galatians chapter 3, 7 through 9 says, "Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith." It's a great reminder to us of God's provision for us as Gentiles, that God always had in his plan to restore man to him, that he always had it in his plan to make Jesus the way that would happen. Let's see. And then finally, in a couple lessons in chapter 13 that we see, and those are, we see Abram and Lot's return. I'm going to skip over the outline because I think most of us know it, but there's this conflict that comes up over the resources, and we see, I think one of the lessons that we really take from this is Lot's choice. And so that's certainly something that we need to think about. And what does Lot choose? He gets this choice. The herdsmen are getting into it with each other, and Abraham says, you choose. Okay, who had the right to first choice, really? Right. Yeah. So, what was that what he was concerned with? What did Abraham want? Peace in his family, peace among his kin, and so he gives Lot the choice, and Lot chooses the good land in terms of what would be good for his herds. But what is the problem with Lot's choice? Bad real estate, right? And so it was a tough neighborhood, and it had Sodom and Gomorrah, and so what we learn from all of that is that detrimental effect that it had on his family, and so and ultimately it costs Lot a lot. All right, we'll see where Mark picks it up if he wants to touch on any of this. There are glimpses of Jesus